The most powerful closure is not something you say to them. It's something you finally do for yourself. It's the moment you stop standing in front of them, with your heart in your hands, trying to convince them that your love is worth treating properly, and you let your behavior speak louder than every speech you've ever given. Because think about how many times you've tried to explain your pain, how many long messages you've written, how many late night calls you've had where you broke yourself open trying to make them see. This is hurting me. This is confusing me. This is not sustainable. And they may have listened, they may have seemed moved, they may even have cried, promised, held you. And for a brief moment you felt hope, but then the pattern resumed, the silence came back, the hot and cold returned, the same emotional distance crept in, and every time that happened your nervous system got the same message. No matter how clearly you argue for your worth, they will only meet you at the level their capacity allows, not the level your heart deserves. So the kind of closure that truly changes the story doesn't come from a perfectly worded final message. It comes from you quietly deciding, I am done trying to convince someone to value what they keep using. And then letting your choices embody that. This kind of closure looks very different from what you imagined. There's no dramatic goodbye scene, no send button that suddenly frees you. Instead, it's a series of small, consistent actions that all say the same thing. I am not fighting for basic respect anymore. You stop double texting when they leave you on read. You stop revisiting the same old arguments in the hope that this time they'll understand. You stop replying instantly every time they decide to drop back into your life. You stop writing essays to defend your needs as if wanting clarity, affection, and consistency is unreasonable, and slowly, instead of chasing closure from them, you create closure within you by refusing to keep participating in the version of the relationship that hurt you. Your behavior becomes your boundary, and your boundary becomes your truth. You no longer argue that you're worthy of being chosen. You act like it. You no longer beg for reassurance. You start giving safety back to yourself. You no longer try to show them you're different from everyone else. You start showing yourself that you're different from the you who tolerated what broke your spirit. And yes, this will confuse them at first, because they are used to your words being loud and your standards being soft. They're used to a pattern where you get hurt, you express, they retreat, you panic, and then you do the emotional work to reconnect. When that pattern stops, when you don't come running, when you don't explode, when you respond shortly or not at all, when your energy is calm instead of frantic, they feel it. Avoidant people don't always respond to your tears, but they absolutely feel the shift when your energy is no longer available on demand. When you start choosing yourself instead of petitioning for another chance with them, your silence around your worth forces them to meet the reality they've been protected from by your constant effort. The reality that you were never going to stay in this loop forever. The beauty of lived closure is that it no longer depends on them doing anything. They don't have to apologize for you to heal. They don't have to understand everything for you to move on. They don't have to acknowledge your depth for that depth to still be real, because you're no longer trying to win the case of why I deserved better. In their mind, you are simply giving yourself better. The text you don't send, the calls you don't make, the arguments you don't reopen, the social media you don't stalk, the small daily decisions to put your energy into your own life instead of into decoding theirs. All of that is closure in action. You are closing the door not on love itself, but on the version of love that asked you to sacrifice your dignity to keep it. And when they eventually feel the absence of your effort and come back with curiosity, regret, or even desperation, The true power of this keynote shows up because you will be standing in a different place inside yourself. You will see their return not as your salvation, but as an option, and you will be able to decide calmly whether their behavior now aligns with the kind of partner you are willing to receive. The closure already happened when you stopped arguing for your value. Everything after that is simply your new standards, choosing what is allowed near your heart. Silent closure is not the silent treatment. It is you finally stepping out of the role of emotional rescuer and refusing to keep fixing what they keep breaking. And that difference is everything, because the silent treatment is a game. It is meant to punish, to control, to make the other person chase and suffer. But silent closure is the opposite. It is when you realize you have spent so long chasing, fixing, explaining, softening, and saving this connection that the only person being punished is you, and you quietly choose to stop playing that role, not because you don't care, but because you care too much about your own sanity to keep bleeding for someone who never learns. You see, in an avoidant dynamic, you slowly become the emotional paramedic. Every time they pull away, you rush in with CPR. Every time they shut down, you revive the conversation. Every time they create distance, you build the bridge. At first you do it out of love, then out of fear, then out of habit, until one day you wake up and realize, this is not a relationship. This is me constantly repairing what someone else repeatedly breaks and never fully owns. And that realization is the birth of silent closure. You stop sending the long texts that carefully walk them through their own behavior. You stop launching, "We need to talk," conversations that always end with you soothing their defensiveness. You stop letting them disappear and then return like nothing happened just because you're afraid to lose them if you hold them accountable. Instead, you allow the cracks to show. You let their silence be their silence. You let their lack of effort be visible. You stop rushing in to cover the holes in the connection, and in that space, you are no longer doing damage control. You're simply refusing to rescue the pattern one more time. This isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The silent treatment says, "I want to hurt you, so I will withdraw my affection." Silent closure says, "I am hurt, and I will no longer chase you or function to keep this alive." One comes from a desire to manipulate. The other from a deep need to stop being manipulated by your own hope. And if you're honest, you know how exhausting that hope became. You kept hoping the next talk, the next chance, the next breakdown would finally make them wake up. And instead, what usually happened is that they got just enough relief from your reassurance to continue avoiding the deeper work. They could feel guilty, cry, say sorry, say, "I'll try," and then lean right back into the same avoidance because they knew, consciously or not, that if things fell apart, you would come in and emotionally sweep the floor again. When you step out of the rescuer role, you break that unspoken contract. You stop holding their emotional hand while they keep pulling away. You stop explaining basic relational behavior as if you are their teacher and they are your project. You stop calling it love when it's actually unpaid emotional labor. Instead, your quiet becomes a mirror. For the first time, they are left alone with the full weight of what they've done. There is no instant reassurance. "No, it's okay. I get you." No free pass back into your heart just because they feel lonely tonight. And this is often the first time an avoidant truly has to face the reality of their own choices, not in theory, but in consequence. They feel the emptiness where your presence used to be. They feel the hollowness of their own space, now that you're not filling it with effort. They feel the discomfort of having no one to offload their guilt to, and in that discomfort, they finally have the opportunity to grow. Whether they take it or not is not your job anymore. Your job is done the moment you stop rescuing. You stop teaching them that they can treat your heart carelessly and still get full access to your love. Your silence is not a weapon. It is a boundary. It says, I will no longer explain why your behavior hurts, my absence will show you. It says, I will no longer argue for what should be obvious. I will simply remove myself from what is harmful. It says, if you want another chance at my heart, you will have to walk toward me on your own 2 feet instead of being carried by my forgiveness. And if they never walk, that is your answer, not about your worth, but about their capacity, because when you stop rescuing someone from their own patterns, you're not abandoning them, you're giving them back to themselves, and you're finally coming back home to you. An avoidant doesn't really feel the loss when your body walks away. They feel it when your energy, attention, and emotional labor stop being available on demand, because for the longest time, it wasn't just your presence they were used to. It was your constant emotional availability, the way you were always just one text away, one call away, one long paragraph away from fixing what they broke, soothing what they triggered, and softening what they refused to face. You could have blocked them for a week and come back with an apology, and they would still feel like, deep down, they hadn't really lost you, because your energy was still tied to them. Your mind was still spinning around them. Your heart was still looking back over its shoulder, and they could feel that pull even in silence. It's why they were so sure they could always circle back, drop a "Hey!" send a memory, poke at your feelings, and plug right back into the same emotional supply. The relationships that mark avoidance the most are not the ones where someone slams a door and disappears dramatically. They are the ones where someone quietly stops being emotionally accessible, where you stop doing the invisible work that kept them comfortable. Your emotional labor was the structural support they never had to pay for. You were the one analyzing their moods, de-escalating their fear, taking responsibility for every conflict, holding the weight of understanding them, far more than they ever tried to understand you. And that labor is what allowed them to stay in their pattern without fully feeling the consequences. Your attention was like a constant background music in their life, always there, always soothing. Even when they pretended they didn't need it, even when they accused you of being too much or too emotional. The truth is, they leaned on your emotional presence more than they will ever admit, and when that music stops, when your attention isn't there to fill the silence, that's when the room suddenly feels empty. They don't feel the loss the day you unfollow. They feel it when they post something, and, for the first time, they notice you didn't watch, didn't like, didn't rush in to decode the hidden meaning. They don't feel the loss when you say, I'm done, because they've heard versions of that before and watched you return. They feel it when you don't come back this time. When weeks pass and you haven't checked in, haven't reached out on their birthday, haven't broken your own boundary like you always used to, that's when it starts to sink in that your energy is no longer revolving around them. They feel it in the moments they use to send a quick message just to get a hit of your love and reassurance. And now their fingers hover over your name, and they know, on some level, this is not the same person who will answer immediately with a soft heart and open arms. They feel it when something good happens, and you're not the first person they tell, because somewhere their nervous system remembers that you used to celebrate them with full joy, and no one else quite matches that. They feel it when something bad happens, and they realize the person who would have listened without judgment, who would have said, I get you, I'm here, is no longer emotionally on call for them. That's the loss. The loss isn't just you being gone. It's them finally having to sit with themselves without you absorbing half of their emotional weight. And this is why you're silent. Grounded closure is so powerful. You're not punishing them. You're simply no longer volunteering as their free therapist. Their constant mirror, their emotional shield, and when that stops, they are left alone with the full volume of their own choices, without your energy there to soften the impact. For the first time, they experience what life feels like without the person who always understood, always reached out, always tried one more time, and that contrast is what makes them feel the loss, not in theory, but in the day-to-day. Because access to your attention was a privilege they treated like a guarantee. Your emotional labor was a luxury they treated like a default setting. And when you finally withdraw it to give it back to yourself, they don't just notice the empty space where you used to stand. They notice the missing feeling of being held by someone who was willing to see past their walls. That is when "you're not ordinary" stops being a nice line and starts becoming a quiet ache, and whether they ever admit it or not, they know deep down that what they took for granted is something they may never find again in the exact same way. You're calm. Consistent detachment forces them to face a reality they've been protected from this whole time, the reality that you were never ordinary. You were the stabilizing force they assumed would stay forever, and as long as you were emotionally available on demand. They never had to fully look at that, because your presence was like furniture in their life, familiar, reliable, taken for granted, always there to sit on when they felt lonely and easy to ignore when they were distracted. But when you detach, not in anger, not in loud threats, but in a steady, grounded way, you quietly remove the illusion that they can behave however they want, and you will still orbit them. You stop reacting to every pull and push. You stop feeding the drama with explanations. You stop chasing their silence with anxious paragraphs, and suddenly the emotional climate changes. There is no more storm for them to blame, no more. You're overreacting, to hide behind, just the echo of their own choices in an empty room where your effort used to be. At first, they might misread it. They might call you cold, distant, different. They might tell themselves you don't care anymore, or that you moved on too quickly. Because it is easier on their ego to believe you flipped a switch than to admit you reached a breaking point after carrying the connection for so long. But underneath those stories, they feel something they didn't feel when you were still emotionally chasing them. They feel your steadiness, your refusal to engage in the old pattern, your lack of panic. And that calm is more confronting than any speech you could deliver, because now they can't tell themselves you're just being dramatic or reactive. They see that you are no longer trying to convince them of anything. You simply stepped back and let the truth stand on its own. Your consistency in detaching is what makes the difference, because hot and cold detachment is just another version of the same cycle. But when you stay steady, when you don't slide back into explaining after one breadcrumb, when you don't abandon your boundary the moment they send a "miss you," you teach their nervous system something new. The person they thought would always cushion, always soften, always understand no matter what, actually has limits. The stabilizing presence they leaned on without honoring now has a spine, not just a heart. And while they may not show it right away, avoidant people are acutely aware of energetic shifts. They feel the loss of your emotional labor when life gets heavy and you're not there to hold their late night confessions. They feel the loss of your encouragement when they face setbacks and you're not the first person they run to anymore. They feel the loss of your grounded energy when their world feels chaotic and the one person who could always turn chaos into clarity is no longer on call. In that gap, they meet a reality they've been shielded from by your constant giving, the reality that you were not just someone who loved them. You were their anchor, their emotional translator, their soft landing, and they treated that like it was replaceable. Your calm detachment strips away the noise and leaves only the contrast, what their life feels like with you fully in it, versus what it feels like without you holding it together. And that contrast is often what breaks through their avoidant denial far more than arguments ever did, because arguments allowed them to focus on your tone, your timing, your intensity. But silence forces them to focus on themselves, their patterns, their avoidance. This is why your job is not to show them you were special with more effort. Your job is to stop protecting them from the experience of losing something special, to let your absence spell out what your words could not, and as that reality sinks in, the narrative they once believed, that you would never really leave, that you needed them more than they needed you, begins to crack. They start to see that you were the rare one in the story, the one who loved deeply, tried repeatedly, forgave generously, and then, when it was no longer safe for your soul, chose yourself, they're begging for another chance, if it happens. Is not born from your anger but from your calm. It's not your rage that wakes them up. It's the quiet proof that you were never ordinary, and you will never again stay in a place that treats you like you are. Their return is not the miracle. The real miracle is the version of you they meet when they come back, the you who no longer believes that their presence alone is a prize, the you who has walked through withdrawal, loneliness, overthinking, and the ache of letting go, and still decided you are worth more than confusion, because before, their return felt like oxygen. The message from them would hit your phone, and your entire body would light up. You would forget the nights you spent crying, the hours you spent waiting, the promises that never turned into patterns. All you could feel was relief. You grabbed that moment like a lifeline, and because you were so afraid of losing them again, you dropped your boundaries. You softened your standards, you rushed to reattach, but that version of you is gone now, not because you became cold, but because you became conscious. You understand that anyone can come back. The real question is, do they come back different? And more importantly, are you different enough to respond from self-respect rather than from fear? The miracle is that when they reappear, they no longer find the person who will immediately overgive to prove their worth. They no longer find the person who will avoid hard conversations to keep them comfortable. They no longer find the person who will accept breadcrumbs and tell themselves, "Least they're here." Instead, they meet someone who has sat with their own pain long enough to realize that love without consistency is emotional chaos. Someone who now understands that accountability is not a bonus, it is a requirement. Someone who recognizes that emotional maturity is not a poetic phrase, it is daily behavior, how they handle conflict, how they handle stress, how they handle the responsibility of your heart. This new version of you doesn't get hypnotized by intensity anymore. You hear, "I miss you." And instead of melting, you quietly ask yourself, "But can you show up?" You hear, "I've changed." And instead of rushing to believe, you watch, you observe. You let time do what your wishful thinking used to do for free. You don't need grand speeches from them, because you've learned that real change is boring. It's consistent text, it's followed up plans. It's staying when things get uncomfortable. It's them saying, "I'm overwhelmed, but I don't want to run. Can we slow down together?" Emotional maturity doesn't erase their fear, but it changes how they handle it. And you've grown enough to know the difference. Their return used to feel like a test of whether you were still lovable. Now it feels like a test of whether they are finally capable of loving you in the way you deserve. And for the first time, you're not desperate to pass their test, you're evaluating whether they pass yours. The miracle is that you can hold two truths at once. You can still feel the tenderness, the memories, the softness you once shared, and at the same time refuse to walk back into a dynamic that broke you. Your heart can miss them and still refuse to accept the old pattern. Your body can remember their touch and still stay loyal to the peace you finally built without them. This is what emotional evolution looks like. Not that you never feel weak, but that you no longer confuse weakness with destiny. You might still feel the urge to answer too quickly, to drop your standard, to fall back into the fantasy of what they could be, but there's a stronger voice now, the one that remembers how it felt to live in constant anxiety, to wait for replies, to explain over and over why you were hurt, and that voice quietly says, "Not again." When they come back, the new you asks different questions. Not, "Do they want me?" but "Do they honor me?" Not, "Will they stay this time?" but "Are they capable of staying and growing?" Not, "How do I make this work?" but "Does this work for who I am now?" You're no longer here to be chosen at any cost. You're here to choose too. Consistency means you no longer accept intense highs followed by vanishing acts. Accountability means you don't pretend the past didn't happen just because you're afraid of scaring them away. Emotional maturity means you are willing to walk away again if they show you with their actions that they are still not ready. Even if that hurts, even if a part of you still loves them. Because the real miracle is not that they realized you're not ordinary. It's that you finally believe it so deeply that you refuse to trade that truth for another round of almost love. And whether they step up or fall away, you stay with the one person you can never afford to abandon again, yourself.